Good morning. My name is Caitlin Akerson, and this is my screencast presentation on slavery in the West Indies. This is my first slide, and it discusses the background information. Slavery in the West Indies began in the mid-1600s. The people who were forced into slavery were captured in African countries and taken to the Caribbean by European settlers. Portuguese ships were utilized to transport the slaves to the West Indies. In total, there were approximately 120,000 enslaved Africans being transported to the West Indies. The ships that transported slaves represented Denmark, as the Denmark flag flew during the voyage. And to pretty much sum up this slide, it talks about how the slaves were transported from one country to another and when slavery began in the West Indies. This is my next slide, and it discusses slave production. Enslaved Africans that worked in the Caribbean worked within a specific system to help get work done. And what this pretty much means is that one group of slaves worked to complete one task while the other group of slaves worked to complete another. They worked in silver and gold mines. Oftentimes, they worked in sugar, coffee, or cotton plantations. Sugar is a more significant production because it was in high demand at the time. So what I can infer about this piece of information is that the slaves that worked on sugar plantations worked twice as hard than any other slaves on other plantations. The crops that slaves produced were traded back to African countries. In addition to crops, slaves played a major role in economic development in the West Indies. This is my next slide, and it discusses slave treatment. Upon arrival in the Caribbean, the enslaved Africans were prepared to be sold to local buyers. In order to prepare the slaves for purchase, they were washed, then oiled to look presentable. And the reason they had to be washed was because, as stated in my previous slide, the slaves were transported via ship. And the ships were not that big, and it was a large group of slaves, meaning they were tightly packed and bunched up together during the voyage, which made them very filthy. When a purchase was made, families were separated, husbands from wives and children from parents. As you can see in the picture to my right at the bottom, it looks like a mother hugging her daughter because they were separated. If the slaves did something wrong, they were harshly punished and publicly humiliated. Punishments included branding, amputation, which is the loss of any limb, and in the worst cases, death. And in another picture to my right, this is another form of punishment known as lynching, but also known as hanging. And the slaves suffered anytime they did something wrong, even if the situation was small. This is my last and final slide, and it discusses the slavery way of life. Slavery in the United States had major differences than slavery in the West Indies. In the West Indies, slaves had to get their own food in their free time. In addition to producing their own food source, they also had to care for the elderly and infirm slaves. In the West Indies, the enslaved lived in small huts on the plantation that were positioned near the master's house. The beds were made of straw on the floor in very small single-room buildings. And as we know, during slavery in the United States, the masters gave the slaves the scraps and the leftovers of their food. But in the West Indies, they had to get their own food and create their own food source. And in addition to this, another one of the major differences was it was really hard to escape slavery in the West Indies because, as we know, a lot of slaves were able to escape in the U.S.